do this. Waiting for that recording sign. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 280 of the In the Tank podcast. We're going to be talking about some basics. I think we got to go back to the basics here. That's going to be the theme of this episode. Talk about some minimum wage, some national debts. Maybe we get into the reality czar. I don't know. We'll see what happens on episode 280. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal. Joining me today, I've got Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing just great. It's Super Bowl week. Very exciting. Nobody's going to any Super Bowl parties.
No, we're not allowed to say those terms, right? It's the big game.
Oh, it's the big game, yeah. But
yeah,
actually,
Pepsi's going to sue the podcast.
That's true. This is the first big game where legalized sports gambling or sports gambling is legalized in almost the entire country now. That's going to be pretty interesting to see how that works out.
Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the center of the American experiment. You got money on the big game.
No, I don't care. Green Bay's not in it, so it's dead to me.
Oh, that's pretty much every year. Samantha Fillmore, State Government Relations Manager at the Heartland Institute. How are you?
Yes, sir. I'm well. My Dallas Cowboys aren't in, but that's been the case for a very long time. So I will just quietly eat my chips and salsa and be quiet.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you the last time that they were in the big game, but Jim, maybe you can fill me in.
Wasn't it 96?
Yeah, 96. They beat the Steelers. That's the last time they were in the Super Bowl.
Ouch! I'm sorry. I'm sorry to bring that up. It's like I did it intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't watched the Super Bowl since 2011.
Big game.
It's the big game. It's not the
big game.
You can't say Super.
Stop saying
Super Bowl.
I haven't watched the big game since 2011.
Oh gosh! All right.
Who did that one?
I don't know. Who cares?
It's Green Bay and the Steelers.
So I want to talk about some of the basics because I feel like my theme of the show, the last few episodes, I've kind of started off with either a theory or a conspiracy theory even. So my theory this week is that I think that people right of center are starting to kind of lose focus of the ideological backbone that usually is kind of like the basis of libertarian conservative thought, that it's like limited government. And I think that this is kind of the result of like a recent kind of heavy emphasis on populism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, populism in and of itself, but like driven by kind of the Trump base, the response to COVID-19, as well as actually the recent events with the whole GameStop debacle that we talked about. Was that last week or 2 weeks ago? I don't know.
Last week.
Time goes by too fast. I can't really keep track of it. But so I feel like this is resulting in thanks, Andy, resulting in like people on our side that are supposed to be generally on our side of the aisle being a little bit squishy on certain things that we kind of just took for granted, like minimum wage, stimulus spending, national debt, and even like energy topics to an extent. We might get into that, Isaac. So that's kind of my thesis on this. And I have some, anecdotal evidence to back that up. Just some like people on social media that I feel like should know better, supporting, increasing the minimum wage to 15 or even higher. But I don't know. It's just that's kind of my thesis. Jim, do you think I'm kind of standing on rocky ground here or shaky ground, or do you think that there's some truth to what I'm saying here?
I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, and I want to start this discussion with some context. And as the old man of the podcast, I probably have more perspective on this than many. But here's an older man, and the quote is this: "I have little interest in streamlining government or in making it more efficient, for I mean to reduce its size. I do not undertake to promote welfare, for I propose to extend freedom. My aim is not to pass laws, but to repeal them. It is not to inaugurate new programs, but to cancel old ones that do violence to the Constitution or that have failed their purpose, or that impose on the people an unwarranted financial burden. I will not attempt to discover whether legislation is needed before I have first determined whether it is constitutionally permissible. And if I should later be attacked for neglecting my constituents' interests, I shall reply that I was informed that their main interest is liberty, and that in that cause I am doing the very best I can."
It was Barack Obama, right?
It was not Barack Obama, as you might imagine. That was Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater, of course, the senator from from Arizona. John McCain ended up taking his seat, as it turns out.
Yeah.
But that's the Barry Goldwater seat in Arizona. But he's the godfather of modern conservatism. Ronald Reagan's famous "Time for Choosing" speech was in 1964 about the election, the presidential election that year, and he was speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater. I think we've played clips of that speech here on this podcast way back in the day. But he inspired Ronald Reagan to think about government as limited and put in place, and constitutionally, and put in place to protect our freedoms and to not impose upon our liberty. And Ronald Reagan, of course, is considered by most one of the best the greatest presidents of the 20th century. Certainly a conservative icon, and will continue to be for decades to come. But he, got his way of thinking through Barry Goldwater. And just him saying that was probably, I didn't look up when that quote was, but, let's just say it was from the 1950s or 60s. That's not all that long ago. And the idea of having a politician in Washington who thinks that, who speaks that, who actually understands the Constitution and sees all around him in Washington the imposition upon our liberties that are protected in the Constitution at all times from everywhere. The only politician in Washington today who even approaches this kind of thinking, this actually very healthy thinking in a healthy republic, is Rand Paul. And with the exception of Rand Paul, I can't think of a single politician, and somebody will correct me, I hope, maybe in the comments under the YouTube version of this podcast, but he is the only one who even approaches the idea that government should be limited, that there isn't an endless mandate for the government to just fix all problems, and that they should look and be fiscally conservative and should be looking to protect our liberty, not to infringe upon it. We are so far from that today. It's actually quite sad. It's inspiring to read that quote from Barry Goldwater, and it's also very sad to realize how far away we are from any people really even thinking about it in Washington today.
Yeah, so Isaac, I mean, this idea, this theme that I've had for this episode, kind of arose from this GameStop thing that we were talking about last week, and I think like maybe you and I might have even been a little bit caught up in some of this stuff.
Oh, I for sure was, yeah,
because to me, and this is just me kind of reading some social media posts from friends and other people that I don't know. But it seemed like it stirred up, this whole GameStop thing stirred up these concepts of class warfare, where the average people kind of aim their ire towards the wealthy just because they're wealthy. And, this isn't like a morally justified position, but, I will say that if there are wealthy people that are leveraging their fortunes to tip the scales in their favor or to rig the game simply because they're losing, then screw them. Like, I totally get that. Screw them. And everyone should be held responsible for their mistakes, no matter how influential they are. And I think that that's what the takeaway from the GameStop story should be. If you over-leveraged yourself, on bets that a stock was going to go down and it went way up instead, hey, that sucks. Sorry, not sorry. That's what you get. You played the game and you lost. But turning this into like a generalized disdain for the wealthy, I think is silly and counterproductive. Did you see anything like that in kind of just your perusal of Twitter and Facebook, Isaac?
Yes, there was a lot of that, but I think a lot of it's merited because, I mean, these financial institutions got bailed out in 2008 when they should have all gone down the tubes. So, like, I'm so sick of socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for everybody else. It doesn't make the system fair, right? So I think one of the reasons we do have populism and sentiments like this, because the game is rigged in many respects against normal people. And I'm not saying the GameStop thing was necessarily rigged, but when you see the SEC come out and say that they're going to investigate, manipulation of stock prices from Reddit subreddits, but they're not going to look into hedge funds at all. Like
right.
The game, I mean, Janet Yellen got $800,000 from the group that is behind a lot of the trading. So, I mean, it's all a bunch of malarkey. And even Mark Cuban was calling out the SEC for being just like this worthless institution that sues people. They try to win cases, not help people, is what he said. But
right.
I would like to push back a little bit on this idea that this is a new phenomenon. I mean, GOP loved spending money and running up deficits during W. It's one of the reasons why we had the Tea Party, frankly. And that's right. No malarkey. So it's only when there's a Democrat in office that the GOP ever starts to care about or even talk about, deficit spending or, balancing the budget or any of that. So,
yeah. And I do want to get to that. And I have specific articles kind of talking about the national debt and all of that. But your point is exactly right. Anyone that's kind of tipping the scales, rigging the system to their advantage, if somebody's too big to fail and the government comes in to rescue them, the average person on my street over here, if they get underwater on their house, the government's not going to come bail them out. So yeah, like that's where we should point our ire, like the manipulation of the government system, not just because somebody's rich. So that's kind of why I want to paint this distinction here. But Samantha, I mean, you've been following this GameStop thing just as closely as we have. Could you see this kind of sentiment of just like us versus the rich type of thing starting to boil up a little bit more?
Absolutely. And I think that everything that is behind those sentiments has been further exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. People are feeling more of a wealth inequality in this country than ever. And we definitely have started to, disseminate the Kool-Aid and get everyone almost hooked on this UBI or sense of entitlement in terms of financial giveaways. So I think it's definitely almost created this wealth and class warfare that might begin to happen. I think that in terms of GameStop, I just want to mirror everything Isaac said, that if someone makes poor investing decisions on their own, they're certainly not being bailed out. I studied a lot of finance in college, so I have a lot of different opinions on some of what happened, but actually technically nothing illegal happened by the Redditors. And there's a little part of me that does think it's kind of satisfying perhaps to see the Wall Streeters and the investment firms and hedge funds beat at their own game, really. I mean, so without going into too much detail, what is illegal is doing a pump and dump, which is where you unfactually claim that a company has more value than it does in order to get people to buy the stock, so then you can increase your own shares and value. But that never happened with GameStop. People on Reddit were not saying, oh yeah, GameStop should be valued at more. They knew that GameStop didn't have a lot of inherent value as a country or as a company. But I mean, it's almost kind of funny too, like the memes that come out of it, because everyone on Reddit was just like, we like the stock, buy the stock, we like the stock. So it's this funny class warfare and just this coming into this new age where now memes have significance, and this is going to affect financial institutions. So I don't know. It's just been fun to watch.
Well, riding on the wave of this kind of this new, just like, screw them, they're rich, we're taking it to them type of thing. I saw a few posts, and this is kind of what stirred up this kind of theme that I'm presenting here in this episode, of people just like talking about like the minimum wage even, and saying like, oh, these rich people can afford to pay you more. Like, your enemy isn't your coworker that's potentially going to get a job instead of you. It's the rich people not paying you more. And like, I've seen that from people that should know better. And that's kind of what was the origin of this whole thing. And when I brought this concept up to a coworker of mine that used to be on this podcast more often, we won't say his or her name, but he brought to my attention a fact that in Florida, in the 2020 election, there was a constitutional amendment on the ballot where 60% of the voters approved this expansion of minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2026. 60% of voters in Florida. Now, I must remind you that Trump won Florida by like 4 points. So there's a lot of Trump supporters in Florida, a lot of people that would consider themselves, smaller government Republican types, that voted for a massive increase to the state minimum wage. So I think like that is probably like my biggest single point of proof of this. But I mean, Jim, isn't that a little bit like, I would think that if we're going to be on here talking about the minimum wage, we're preaching to the choir, but maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I don't think it is the case anymore. I mean, look, the Republican Party. I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we talk about conservatism and libertarianism and things on principle. But in practical terms, the Republican Party is supposed to be the fiscal conservative party. not just in Washington, but in every state across the country. And when was the last time you heard any politician talk about economics, talk about the need to rein in spending, or, as you just mentioned, to argue against a raise in the minimum wage? I mean, look for it. The memes are not hard to find. The result of a $15 minimum wage is that you were going to see more and more and more touchscreen kiosks in fast food restaurants across the country. I mean, let's just say I've gone to Taco Bell a couple times in the last couple months, and
that's Isaac's favorite.
Yes. Well, yeah. Yeah, Taco Bell is one of those things that's you have a real craving for it, and then you remember why you last craving for it was 2 months ago, and so you have to relearn it every time. But there were kiosks at the local Taco Bell where you can make your order, and so where there used to be maybe 15 or 20 people at a fast food joint, having to work and deal with customers, now there's half of that, or even fewer than that, because if you have a touch screen, all you really need are a couple people to make the food, and then just bring it out to you, and that's it. And a $15 minimum wage is going to cost jobs. There is study after study after study that shows that for every hike in the minimum wage, it costs jobs, because businesses are not there to provide. I'm sorry to say this to everybody. This is a little bit of a reality check for some of you, but a business does not exist to give you a job. A business exists to provide jobs to anybody. A business exists to make money for the owner or the shareholders, and they will try to maximize profits as much as they can to survive in lean years and to enjoy the fat years. But the idea that that these companies can pay you more, yes, they do pay you more when you're worth more. The idea of paying you arbitrarily paying somebody $15 an hour, as they walk in the door before they have any skills that have shown that is useful to your company, but to basically try them out to see if they're going to be of use to your company is going to cost you $15 an hour. Many businesses are just going to say, forget it. It's not worth it. And in the restaurant business, in which this is probably felt more keenly, because there's lots of turnover, there's lots of young people that get their start working in restaurants, they're just not going to hire anymore. And if we're going to increasingly delivery services, they'll just they'll just say, well, we're mostly carry out, we only need a few people here for that, and we'll let DoorDash or Grubhub or anyone else take care of that for us. Raising the minimum wage destroys jobs. And it used to be every time there was a proposal to raise the minimum wage, you could find a Republican to say so. And now nobody is saying so. And as you said, it's quite depressing that in Florida, deep Trump country, it's run by Samantha. You'd have to tell me. I know the governor, of course, DeSantis, is a Republican. I think the legislature is also controlled by Republicans. And they're entertaining a $15 minimum wage as if they were Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was bringing this $15 minimum wage was literally only brought up by Bernie Sanders like 3 years ago. Now it's just universal, policy. Everybody should embrace it. This is nuts. There isn't a single party in the United States that stands up for any kind of fiscal sanity anymore. Sad.
Oh yeah, no, it's out the window. And I mean, that's like definitely the case when we get to some of the stimulus and national debt talk that we're going to get to in a minute. But I just want to harp on this minimum wage thing, because apparently people need a reminder. So I've got this article. This is from Cato Institute, and the article is titled "The Distorted Minimum Wage Debate." The article points out how people on this issue, and I would say a lot of different issues, are seemingly living in two different realities when it comes to the minimum wage debate. So you could it paints this idea where you could theoretically, somebody could find two different articles published on the same day, one saying that there's no evidence that increasing minimum wage hurts jobs, while the other article says that the evidence is clear that, it does hurt jobs. So it's just how do we exist, where these two different realities are coinciding? So to combat this idea, this is kind of based on that concept where it's if you look hard enough, you can find a study that supports whatever position that you have, whatever. So to combat this idea, we've got people like David Newmark and Peter Shirley, who are with the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they just published a study called Myth or Measurement: What Does the New Minimum Wage Research Say About Minimum Wages and Job Losses in the United States? Bit of a mouthful of a title, but whatever, I'll give it to you guys. So what they did was they basically took every study that has been done since the 90s and cataloged the outcomes. And they found out that there's a clear preponderance of negative estimates in the literature In our data, 79.3% of estimated employment elasticities are negative. 55.4% are negative and significant at a 10% level or better, and 47.9% are negative and significant at the 5% level or better. So taking out the jargon, it basically means that like nearly 80% show exactly what Jim was saying, that this is going to result in job losses and, not job gains. 80%. They also found out that the evidence of negative employment effects is stronger for teens and young adults, and more so for the less educated. So like, this is just like basics, man. This is basics. And it's shown by the majority of the studies that have been done over the last 3 decades. So whenever you hear someone like Paul Krugman suggesting that like, it's there's the evidence isn't clear, like it's pretty damn clear. So I think like we need to forget all of this, this idea that we can somehow increase everyone's livelihoods by just mandating that their employers pay them more, and recognize the reality that government mandates have unintended consequences, and generally they're very negative. So, Samantha, you are in government relations here at the Heartland Institute. Do you see, without throwing any specific people under the bus, that like general sentiment from lawmakers that Jim was suggesting, that they're not quite as gung-ho about going after these ridiculous proposals like the one in Florida?
Well, to speak specifically to Florida and to follow up on a question that you had posed, Florida is one of the trifectas, which means that it is a Republican-controlled legislature in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and obviously Governor DeSantis. So that is good. But it does pose the question, then why is this minimum wage hike even a thing? To give credit where credit is due, Governor Ron DeSantis did speak out about the minimum wage hike. However, the way that minimum wage hikes are written in most state constitutions requires that they are done by ballot initiative. So you can have an entirely a case like Florida where there is an entirely controlled Republican legislature and you're still getting this passed. It's a cognitive dissonance, for a lack of better terms. I mean, so about 61% of Floridians voted for Donald Trump, and more specifically, it was 64.48% of Floridians voted for the $15 minimum wage hike. So there were almost everyone, in theory, who voted for the president, or President Trump, did also vote for this minimum wage hike. And I think it shows honestly, a lack of understanding of what the economic and social consequences are to these bills. I think pick anyone off the street, they don't quite understand. And yet we live in this world where everyone is flooded with social media and taglines. So they're hearing all of these democratically proposed handouts, bailouts, universal basic income, stimmies, if you will, and they are starting to wonder where their money is coming from too. And I don't know if it's really a lack of composition of conservative thought on these lawmakers, but they know where their bread is buttered. They know what will get them elected again. And unfortunately, and this was my fear with the stimulus checks, was that it was going to red pill America, if you will, red pill Americans into thinking that universal basic incomes and socialism and things like free handouts and giveaways would become the norm. And that's what it's nice to see that check deposited in your bank account and to then wonder, why can't I do this all the time? And again, it's without that lack of economic consequence that a lot of these people are making these decisions. A recent Pew Research Center study poll found that 67% of Americans support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In 2020, 21 states passed measures to raise the minimum wage. So it's rough, but I do want to point out that, proving your point and proving what Jim said, a study done by Cornell University showed that there was no reduction in poverty in 28 states that have passed minimum wage hikes since the onset of the millennium. So it really does not do a lot for advocating and raising, I guess, people out of poverty, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
it does the opposite because the poor people can't get jobs to start out in life, and this idea that there are businesses out there paying somebody the minimum wage forever or like for any extended period of time. That's not true. That's not how people are not making the minimum wage for years on end. It's an introductory wage to prove your mettle, and any business that wants to be successful will soon and quickly raise the wages of the people they need to keep to make their business successful. So it's not a surprise that it doesn't pull people out of poverty. One, because when you raise it, fewer people, especially on the lower end of the economic spectrum, can get jobs. And two, they're not making that money all the time. They get quick raises if they prove themselves worthy of the business. And there are no discussions about this. I mean, you just cited those studies, Samantha, but I'd like to see Governor DeSantis, although he's opposed to the minimum wage, actually get out there in the public and make the case for it. Make the scientific, the data-based case for it, for not raising the minimum wage, and nobody does.
I mean, I think really quickly, what's unfortunate about it is that it's a numbers game at this point now. The people who are the group that makes up the lower income minimum wage working class is propagating, and it's all numbers. Those are the voters. Those are who are going to go out in droves and vote for their representatives. And again, like I said, these elected officials know where their bread is buttered, and it's becoming a fight for numbers for people who understand what these unintended negative consequences are of minimum wage hikes, and just the people who they just hear more money. And I mean, if someone told me I could make more money tomorrow, they'd at least I'd give them a little bit of my attention for a moment,
Right. You can't deny that.
Right.
But yeah, just some basics. We went over some of these, but just to kind of list them out on minimum wage, results in job losses. Like that's what that 80% number is that I talked about in that study, which everything that we talked about is in the show notes if you're curious about the study itself. Jim already mentioned this, leads to automation, self-service stations, kiosks, et cetera, hurts low-skilled workers disproportionately. That is also what the study that I talked about was. Does not reduce poverty. Samantha brought that one up. May result in higher prices for consumers. We haven't talked about that. So, these companies have costs. Employing people is a cost. So when that cost goes up, it gets translated into the cost of the goods or services that they're selling. So we've seen that in studies as well. And also, this might be one of the more important ones, that it hurts smaller businesses disproportionately because larger businesses can absorb the added costs easier than their smaller competitors. So that's why you actually see some of these large businesses like giving lip service to the idea of raising minimum wage when you're like, wait, that means that you're going to have to pay your clerk a little bit more. And it's because their competitors down the street will less be able to do that. Isaac, you and I were probably more on the Trump train, especially at the beginning of the administration. Do you think that him and his admittedly populist messages is to blame partially for this, some of the things that Samantha was saying, that politicians know that this is a numbers game, and maybe if they don't talk about these things because it seems a little less politically advantageous, then, that's led to this kind of softening of things that were generally, pretty hard line for, minimum wage arguments?
No, because Honey Boo Boo was a thing far before the Trump administration was around. So my argument is, did I lose everybody?
Hearing you, go ahead. Okay.
All right. You all froze on my screen. So no, my argument is people just don't know a lot about economics. They don't care a lot about economics. They see the most direct route to them getting what they want, and they go for it, even though they don't look to see if there are, potentially unintended consequences of it. I saw somebody post, this girl posted her AMC buying. She bought $23,000 worth at $18. And she's like, I'm just going into surgery, and I was hoping it would be not tanking when I came out. And people do this stuff all the time, right? So
did it tank?
Oh yeah.
Oh jeez.
it tanked. So I don't know what it's at right now. But
that if Jim brought up Rand Paul. If Rand Paul was running for president, he would be talking about these things day in and day out. Yeah, this raising the minimum wage sounds great, but it has all these terrible unintended consequences. I feel like Trump was way less apt to kind of give people the hard truth.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Okay.
But
I mean, I do say that I don't know if Trump was even fully aware of all the negative unintended consequences of raising minimum wages.
Yeah, but it's kind of this. It's okay. Well, let's move on.
But do you think anybody would care that Rand Paul was saying that? Like, that's my question.
Well,
like,
if his campaign wasn't
saying like we got to tax the millionaires and the billionaires and everybody gets $15 an hour, then like I don't know if that resonates with people, because if they see that as an immediate increase in their quality of life, even though they don't understand that if minimum wage goes from $7.50 to $15, I'm raising the rents at my apartments. Like,
sure,
that's just going to happen. I'm going to soak up all that sweet increase in the minimum wage.
All right, well, let's talk about something that's a little less theoretical, hypothetical, and that's this idea of the stimulus packages, right? So earlier in the pandemic, what we all got, like $1,200 a piece or something like that. Then several months went by, and then they were going back and forth about passing a second stimulus package, and then finally it passed, and it gave everybody $600, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's just crumbs," which, you know, I get it. It's in the grand scheme of things, that was a very small fraction of that multi-trillion-dollar bill or whatever it was. But then after it passed, and this is kind of in the waning days of the Trump administration, he came out and did like a little speech where he chastised the $600 crumbs per person and said it should be $2,000 per person. And he didn't like suggest, you know, narrowing the focus of the stimulus to people that are worst hit by the lockdowns or anything. Like, no, everyone gets one. Now, obviously, there was a cap on, you know, how much money you would get per year, or, you know, if you were able to get it. But then, you know, after he was saying everyone should get $2,000, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came out and said, "Yeah, I agree. Everyone should get $2,000. Let's get this done." And there was nobody on the other side of the aisle saying like, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't just be shoveling cash out into the streets like this, because A, who doesn't want free money? And B, who wants to be the person saying that people shouldn't have free money?" So again, it's just like, it's like, you know, usually I think Michael Malice says that like conservatism is just like liberalism without the with the brakes on. It's like there's no brakes anymore. It's just everyone's just going to race to just dole out as much money as possible. It's kind of insane. And I don't know what it's going to lead to. I mean, we have a national debt that's approaching $28 trillion. And you've got Biden talking about the latest stimulus package that's like $1 trillion and suggesting that this is just a down payment, that this is just the beginning of all of this. So it's like at this pace, we're looking at like a $40 trillion national debt by the end of the Harris administration's first term. Like it's insanity, Jim. Like, how do we get back to normal? I don't know.
I don't know that we ever will. I'm old enough to remember the Newt Gingrich Republican Revolution of 1994, and they had their contract with America. And one of the most important things that really resonated back then, this resonated with voters back then, the idea of a balanced budget. People talked about and voted on fiscal issues in this way. They thought that Washington was spending too much money and that we can't afford to do this forever. And we need to start putting, as Michael Malice would say, put the brakes on a little bit. And it took, I think, 5 or 6 tries, but Newt Gingrich was finally able to get Bill Clinton to sign a balanced budget. So that was like 1995. That was the last time, and maybe the only time in anyone's lifetime, that a president had balanced a budget, or at least signed a document that said, let's balance the budget. Either way, I mean, the budget documents are frankly useless, because it's the appropriations process where the money is spent, not the budget process. But putting that aside, we are so far away from that. I mean, that was what was that 30 years ago that we last had a balanced budget, or nobody ever runs on balanced budget amendments anymore. I mean, the Heartland Institute does push them. And frankly, I guess Samantha might even be able to speak to this a little bit more, working in government relations here, where you see these kinds of balanced budget amendments. In fact, there's several states that require a balanced budget. I think California is one, which is hilarious because they get around the rules. So these things don't even mean anything anymore. There's no balanced budget there. But the idea of spending $1 trillion like it's nothing, and it's now accepted. I mean, we gotta face facts. Trump did that. Trump had no interest whatsoever in reining in spending, zero. Zero. And maybe that's because he was a retail politician who understood that people, as sad as it may be to say, people don't want to hear that you don't want to give them $600 or $1,200 or $2,000, even though you've lost your job and the economy is in the crapper, and you can't go outside, you can't go to work. The idea of getting $600 or $1,200 should actually be infuriating to the American people. It's like, you've destroyed my life and you're going to give me $1,200 and I'm supposed to be grateful? That's insane. I mean, like, you can't live on that, but it's basically maybe they're paying those $1,200 just to keep people from rioting. Oh, I'm sorry. We had riots, so that didn't work either. But maybe it's to keep them from storming the Capitol. Oh no, they stormed the Capitol too. So I don't know. I mean, it just seems to me that our government now is just trying to bribe the people to keep them quiet and happy. But I think the latest COVID relief package, which is not actually about COVID relief, is just about a bunch of other stuff. But wasn't the price tag on that $1.9 trillion? And it's not debated. It's not, nobody knows what's in it. It's just, all right, let's just spend $1.9 trillion. And everybody just yawns. In the 1990s, you would have been tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail if you were a Republican and you proposed that sort of thing. It's like, we've come so far from any sense of fiscal responsibility. It's and like you said, Donnie, we're going to have $40 trillion in national debt in not too much in the future. And at some point, this has to end. At some point, it's going to be a huge disaster. We are going to turn into, a Zimbabwe, a country that doesn't have any economic power anymore because we've spent too much.
So I want to circle back to quote another older gentleman, much like you did in the beginning of this, Jim. Alexis de Tocqueville is one of my favorite political theorists, but he has a quote that says, "The American Republic will endure until the day Congress discovers that it can bribe the public with the public's own money." And is that not the most poignant quote for the day or for the topic? So right now, the current public debt is over 100% of the United States' GDP, which is terrifying. In 1991, so 30 years ago, it was 43%. So I think it's actually 120% now. So we've raised it 80% in 30 years. And there is a point, and no one in economics knows this is a highly contested number, in fact, but there will be a point of no return where when our total amount of public debt is such a large percentage of our GDP that we just cannot get out from under it. It's absolutely terrifying. And generally, when you look at the histories of the nation, or the histories of the world, or the nations of the world, wow, sorry, you realize that once nations' total debt starts to hover around 100%, that's when they start to have economic collapses. Into the modern world, we've kind of learned in economics that you can operate on a little bit more debt than previously thought, but this is outlandish. It's insane. And I'm fearful it's going to be 150, 160% of GDP by the time, if ever, we get a Republican president or majority again.
Wouldn't the argument, Samantha, be that, like, look, we already at 120% debt versus debt against GDP, and we had COVID, and we basically have smashed our economy with a sledgehammer about as hard and as long as possible, and we aren't dead. So isn't that actually an argument that, like, we can just keep taking on more? Because if this didn't kill us, nothing will, right?
Hey, I've gone this far in this discussion without talking about modern monetary theory, but that's exactly what those modern monetary theorists would say.
Jim just got owned.
No, I mean, but like, we are totally going full bore into it. And to the quote that Samantha brought up, the idea of trying to bribe the country with their own money, it's like this isn't even tax money anymore. They're printing it. Like, there was some figure that 40% of every dollar in existence has been printed in the last 10 months or something like that. Like, it's
money printer go burr.
I don't think they actually print it anymore. I think they just make it in the digital
just keep
world.
hitting zeros.
Yeah, they just hit enter, tab and enter. Like, it's absolutely bizarre, but it just, they would talk about how, we can print a ton of money. They would point at Japan and say that Japan's debt to GDP ratio is way higher than ours, and they're doing okay, so that's what they would suggest. I want to go back to some of the basics. and talk about all of the concerns that I would have over a potentially $40 trillion national debt. We know that for however long I've been alive, they've been talking about how this is like increasing the burden on like our future generations. It's increasing the burden on current generations at this point. The interest payments on the debt alone is hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's just going to go up if interest rates goes up. And it's going to go up as soon as the debt goes up as well. So, and then it also puts the US dollar reserve currency status, the world reserve currency status of the US dollar in jeopardy. Because if the dollar is kind of undermined by this constant printing, I mean, the return key on that computer has got to be getting worn out by now. But like the consequences of that going away could be dire, like could be humongous. The ramifications of that, I don't even think that we could put in perspective. Like it's insane. And it's just flat out unsustainable. At some point, reality will set in and we will know that we can't just continue to put stuff on the credit card. And at that point, we're going to have to make cuts. And not cuts, Nancy Pelosi, the cupboard is bare after cutting 1% in, however long ago that was. But like real substantial cuts that are going to really hurt. So like that's when we're putting all of our chips in this basket of just put everything on the credit card, like we're really running the risk of some big consequences. But I don't know. Like Isaac, do you think that like there's going to be a return to normalcy at some point, or should we just start planning for an $80 trillion national debt in 10 years?
Well, the problem is letting people fail is unpopular. Do you see that becoming less of a thing as millennials take over? I mean, we're like that everybody gets a trophy generation. So
right.
Like everybody hates on the boomers, and to some extent it's merited, but I think like we haven't even had the chance to screw things up yet. So let's maybe like hold our judgment for a little bit.
You guys screwed it all up, boomers. We haven't even given a chance yet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they raised us, so we can always blame them still, but
it taught us in schools.
That's right. Yeah. We're the product of a boomer education, but
good thing. I'm glad I'm not a boomer. Keep ripping them. It's not me.
Hey, we didn't say anything.
Yeah, Jim's the greatest generation. So
I look great.
You look really good for it. I mean, real good.
Yeah,
I work out.
The most handsome, greatest generation man this side of the Mississippi.
Yeah, but like honestly, the biggest pushback is from Republicans saying like, "Oh no, let's not spend 1.9 trillion. Let's spend $600 billion." It's like we can't afford that. We can't even afford negative $600 billion.
Right,
Like, it needs to be even worse than that.
The fact that we just print the money and we don't actually ask people to pay it is the reason why we're able to do it. Because if you actually had to raise the taxes to balance the budget, then people would be outraged over cowboy poetry, right? Then people would actually have to feel it, and they don't. So we've talked about this before, like the withholding of the income tax over the course of the year is criminal. You should have to write the government a check, and the election should be the next day. Like that would be my preference, right? But I think I saw something like 30% of companies would be underwater or out of business right now if we didn't have such cheap credit. So, I mean, like that's another thing. I don't necessarily know that there's going to be some sort of fire and brimstone, like total economic meltdown collapse, as much as I think that like we're probably just going to have low economic growth. Like Japan.
See, exactly. And that's exactly what I would argue. I mean, run the risk, the higher the national debt, the more the risk of some type of like mega collapse, something seismic like that. But yeah, if we were to just go the route of Japan, yes, you would see a slow decline in the rate of increase in the GDP. You would see a slow decline in the amount of disposable income for the average family. And you would just basically just like ride this slow wave down into serfdom. Like that's kind of what I would expect.
The Middle Ages.
Isaac,
the last thing I want to say is like, okay, so we have the reserve currency of the world, so we can just print money. Who else is going to take that from us? Like who else?
Reserve currency?
Yeah.
I know.
Who's going to be better or more trustworthy at repaying their debts?
So I mean, do you want the answer to that question? You're just asking rhetorically.
Samantha had a very interesting suggestion in the chat, which is Dogecoin.
Yeah, that was Andy typing
No,
under
but-
Samantha's name. But no, the reality.
I support it.
There are ideas out there. One is called it's called SDRs. I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's basically like a basket of currencies, and it's all operated by the IMF. And they've even floated this idea of having a digital version of these SDRs that are out there that would serve as a global reserve currency. So that would totally undermine the US dollar. It's been an idea that's been floated out there for a long time. And it's been floated out there even stronger more recently. So, people from the World Economic Forum talking about this kind of gets my attention. But Isaac, I do want to mention something specifically about energy to you. Joe Biden, he did a speech recently talking about renewable energy and how we need to reinvest in renewable energy and all of that stuff. And I know that he did lip service to global warming when he was talking about this, but the thing that he talked about mostly during this was the idea of jobs. Mm-hmm. And all of this stuff is going to be done under the guise of getting more jobs, right? So this wasn't this like idealistic environmentalist outreach type of thing, talking about the existential crisis of global warming. It was this populist idea of we need to get you guys more jobs. So it's like, your sector that your expertise is in is not immune to this idea of this like populism too. So, I mean, like, do you see yourself trying to construct arguments against that specific, facet of that conversation?
Oh, for sure. So what we do is we talk about the fact that almost all of the wind and solar jobs are construction jobs that are temporary. So that in and of itself is a fun one to talk about. The wages are generally lower than fossil fuel jobs. And then we also look at the point that Jim was alluding to earlier. The point of the energy industry isn't to create jobs, it's to create energy. And the number of megawatt hours or the amount of electricity generated per job is an important metric. So we look at, okay, what are the most efficient ways to generate electricity on an employment basis? And wind and solar are pathetic in that regard. So yeah, we do talk about that. Whether anybody will care is another question, but we're trying to make them care. But I think really it's going to have to boil down to people being like, why are my electric rates going up? And then we can say, well, these are incredibly unproductive jobs that you've mandated. So that's part of it.
Yeah, I feel like, unfortunately, like that's going to be followed up with this idea of, less jobs or, less paying jobs or even higher electricity rates. They'd be like, well, that's going to be part of the next stimulus package. We're going to subsidize people.
We just need to raise rates on the people that can afford it and keep them low for the people that can't. So
right,
that's it. It's all a shell game. It's a Ponzi scheme. How do we grab the money from the people that have it and redistribute it to?
No, it's not even grabbing it from the people. It's like we said, it's printing it. You just print it and shovel it to people that need it. Like we're so far from
rates is a little different, right? Because that is actually going to somebody's bill, right? Unless you're going to have a federal program that does that.
That's exactly what I'm suggesting they're going to do. We are so far from economic reality at this point that what's stopping them from doing some type of energy bill relief fund in 2026,
Well, so it's like Governor Gavin Newsom earlier in 2020 when he passed the mandate that will eventually require California to move to all electric vehicles, which inherently are so much more expensive than gasoline powered vehicles. And next thing you know, you're going to have 20 years from now, you're going to have the California legislature pushing out tax subsidies to make sure everyone gets a Tesla, right? Because it economically makes no sense. And yet we're pushing these requirements on people. So we're just digging ourselves deeper in the hole. Money printer, go burr. I don't.
Jim, I'm going to give you the last word on all of this. I mean, do we just need to embark on some new campaign to just re-solidify these basics of libertarian and conservatism thought on these basic ideas?
I think we do, and that's part of the purpose. That's why the Heartland Institute has been in existence for 37 years, is to educate legislators and the public and the media on, basic on basic rights that are, protected for you in the Constitution, and basic economic rights. We were founded by economists sitting around a table at lunch in Chicago in 1984, saying that, the people need to understand economics a lot better. And it is sad that people don't understand economics at all. I mean, going back to what Isaac said, poor people will see their energy bills, to heat their house double. And they'll wonder why, and they'll complain to their elected officials, and their elected officials, of course, will not tell them that we did this to you. We
the elected officials will call in the energy companies and yell at them for raising the rate.
right.
Like Andrew Cuomo did when he did not let a gas pipeline go to New York. And then he was mad that gas prices went up. It's like, this is the world we live in. People think milk comes from the store. So I don't know.
Yeah. And energy comes from the plug in your wall.
That's where it comes from.
That's right. And so the politicians will make everyone's energy bills go up. And then, as Isaac said, blame the energy companies for that, when they're the ones who did it, because they made the energy companies produce more solar and wind power, which the power companies, by the way, love, because they get to charge more for their product. And so it always comes down to every price. There's, like, as Milton Friedman said, who was a big fan of the Heartland Institute, there's no such thing as a free lunch, because everything has to be paid for by somebody. And that somebody is you. And that somebody increasingly are the poorest among us, especially when it comes to energy prices. But, I wonder where our economy is going to go. As you guys were talking about what is going to be the global base currency going forward, I was just thinking to myself, centuries ago, millennia ago, the gold coin of the Roman realm was the coin of the realm. It was the base currency of the world, and that's gone. And I think the idea, I think we all have this idea, and I think it's a dangerous one, that it can't happen to America, that we will always be this strong, that there's nothing to worry about. We can spend whatever we want. We can print as much as we want. We'll always be on top. That's not true. That's not true. We won't always be on top. And in fact, probably in the lifetime of many people listening to this podcast, especially the two youngins here on this podcast, you might see that the American dollar is no longer the global currency. It'll probably be something digital, something like a Bitcoin, that will be a global currency, and that, the American dollar basically will cease to exist. That could happen in the next 30, 50, 60 years. In the 20th century, they would say that if America sneezed, the world would get a cold economically. What happened if not only is America sick, but almost dead? Then what happens to the world economy? And I am really scared to find out.
Yeah, no, it's troubling stuff. Yeah, I don't know. Modern monetary theorists would say, no, we just print that lunch. Like, it is free. We just print it. So I don't know. We'll see what happens, but it's just, like I said, we are so far from economic reality. It is frightening.
But here's just one thing, actually. What if we do come to full collapse? What if there's full economic collapse and there's riots in the streets?
Then we are still going to do this podcast.
We're still going to do this podcast. But, maybe to bring it all the way back, I read that quote from Barry Goldwater for a reason, and it's because we used to think that way as a country. It used to be part of the American, bloodstream to think that way, that government exists to protect your rights. The Constitution exists to keep the government from infringing upon your rights and to allow you your own pursuit of happiness. Maybe it will come to this. Maybe we need an entire economic and societal collapse in order to return to a constitutional government that respects your rights and is smaller. Eventually, we can't afford this huge government forever. And, I guess the upshot of not being able to afford it anymore is that it will eventually get smaller.
Yeah, well, I think if I had to put my money on it, if I had to put my Dogecoin on it, I would go with the Japanese route, where just slow decline into just like stagnation, and just like you have less money for entertainment on the weekends, and just slowly your standard of living just goes down over years and decades. That's my guess. Real quick, we got like 5 minutes here, but I do want to talk about this last thing. I was trying to set up that we're so far from economic reality as a segue to talk about this proposal for a Biden administration reality czar, but Jim stepped all over that. So Jim, I'm going to put this on you. Explain to me what this proposal for a reality czar is.
Well, as I understand it, it's a proposal, but it's the idea that free speech is dangerous. You can't have people saying wrong things. The government or somebody appointed by the government, a czar, will determine what is truth and what is false. They will punish those who say false things, and I suppose reward those who tell the government-approved truth. There's going to be a long list of very un-American proposals from the Biden administration. This one, I would hope, would be in the top 3, and there would be nothing worse than it. But the idea that you need government, or even the quasi, the cabal between government and our social media overlords, combining to police speech and punish those, and only allow the reality that they think exists to exist, and punishing all those who disagree with it. There's just nothing more un-American than that. And what sucks is that our media, our mainstream corporate media, has not reported on this critically at all. It comes down to us having to say something, or people on the right having to say something. As they still can. I'm
looking at this New York Times article, how the Biden administration can help solve our reality crisis. And the author kind of paints this one-sided picture of this nation wrapped up in conspiracy theories, because apparently conspiracy theories only exist on the right side of the aisle. There's no conspiracy theories on the left. Everyone's saying that 9/11 was an inside job that George Bush orchestrated. That's not, that never happened.
Oh, and him and Condi were a thing.
Right. So after painting this one-sided picture of right-wing conspiracy theorists, it suggests that Biden administration should create a position of a reality czar to combat fake news. And this isn't tongue in cheek. This isn't Babylon Bee or anything like that. This is a real suggestion out there. When I first saw this article, I was afraid that it was an actually appointed thing. Thank goodness it's just a proposal at this point. But a reality czar, isn't that a position in the Soviet Union? I'm pretty sure that there's somebody underneath Kim Jong-un in North Korea that has that title. This is what?
My favorite thing about it is that it is in fact called the reality czar. They're not even hiding the socialist inflections in this position. It's just this was a spot in Lenin's cabinet. I mean, sure, let's just do it.
I don't know. You talk about there being no conspiracy theories or no false fake news on the left. I'll give you one. This will probably get the podcast banned, but hands up, don't shoot was fake news.
Oh, that was.
I would have gone with the Russian.
I was going to go with Trump never won the election. That was that's a gimme.
Yeah. What if this is all just an attempt to increase the quality of reality TV, though? What if you guys aren't giving this?
Yeah, we're not reading into it. This is actually about having another season of Survivor. Is that?
Yeah, or not allowing the Kardashians to stop. What if that's what this is, and you guys are being overly critical for no reason? I'm just saying, keep an open mind.
All right, we will, and we should probably just leave it at that. Anyone else got any last bits, words of wisdom, anything they want to get off their chest before we sign off for the week? Looking at you, Isaac. Remember when you used to have a joke every week?
And then I ran out of jokes, and I didn't.
Yeah, after 3 weeks, you ran out of jokes.
I know.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the In the Tank Podcast. If you like our show, please subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. It would be greatly appreciated. You can find us on pretty much everything nowadays, whether it's Stitcher, Google, YouTube, SoundCloud, pretty much everything nowadays. If you'd like, you can send us your comments, suggestions, questions to the show by emailing us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim, where can the fine people find you?
You can find me at Jay Lakely on Twitter. You can follow the Heartland Institute at Heartland Inst on Twitter, and always visit heartland.org.
Isaac Orr, same question.
You can find me at The Fracking Guy on Socialist Twitter, and you can find me at AmericanExperiment.org.
When's Parler coming back? Samantha Fillmore, where can the fine people find you?
You can just find me doing work here at the Heartland Institute and any of the publications that are attached to my name on the bio, and keep up with state government relations.
All right, fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.